It wasn't a failure of diplomacy. It wasn't a lack of funding. It wasn't even a breakdown in command. It was a failure of geology. The arithmetic is merciless. You can print currency, you can print bonds, you can even print contracts. But you cannot print the conductive metal required to guide a missile to its target. The pattern is unmistakable. We are witnessing the collision of infinite financial ambition with finite physical reality. The United States defense industrial base is not stalling because of politics. It is stalling because the periodic table does not negotiate. Current data suggest we have entered a critical window of resource depletion. The inventories are draining, the mines are degrading, and the demand is vertical. This is not a story about market speculation. This is a story about the physical inability to project power when an empire can no longer source the raw materials for its own defense. The outcome is written in stone. History does not deal in probabilities, it deals in constraints and right. Now, the primary constraint is silver, not silver as jewelry, not silver as money. Silver as the irreplaceable strategic component in every switch, every relay, and every guidance system in the modern arsenal. The incentive is to ignore this. The payoff for ignoring it is short-term stability. The risk is total systemic failure. Under these constraints, the rational move for the state is to hide the shortage until it becomes undeniable, but the math is already screaming. We are watching the same sequence that brought down the greatest powers in human history. It starts with dominance, it moves to overextension. It ends in a desperate scramble for hard assets. When the paper promises dissolve, the timeline is compressing. The warning signs are flashing red, and the mechanism of collapse is already in motion. To understand why the most sophisticated military on Earth is currently struggling to replenish its stockpiles of Tomahawk and Patriot missiles, one must look past the headlines of budget squabbles and look directly at the industrial supply chain. The modern war machine is an electronic organism. It does not run on coal or steel alone. It runs on the flow of electrons through highly specific pathways. Silver is the most conductive element known to man. It has no substitute in high-performance electronics. Without it, a missile is just a flying tube of fuel. It cannot think, it cannot steer, and it cannot detonate with precision. For decades, the assumption was that silver was abundant, cheap, and readily available. That assumption is now colliding with the geological wall. The pattern we are seeing today, where a dominant power suddenly finds itself hollowed out by a lack of physical resources, masked by monetary debasement, is not new. It is the standard operating procedure of imperial decline. We will examine this pattern through three specific historical case studies: the Roman Empire, the Spanish Empire, and the British Empire. In each case, the trajectory was identical. A peak of dominance followed by unsustainable costs leading to a monetary shortcut, which eventually exposed a critical physical weakness. Our first case study is the Roman Empire, specifically the period spanning from the reign of Nero to the crisis of the 3rd century. The Roman economy was built on the silver denarius. This small coin, roughly the size of a modern dime, was the lifeblood of the legions. It paid the soldiers who guarded the Rhine and the Danube. It bought the wheat from Egypt that fed the mob in Rome. For centuries, the denarius was a standard of purity, containing approximately 45 grams of pure silver. It was trusted from the sands of Syria to the snows of Britannia, but the costs of empire are cumulative, while the sources of plunder are finite. By the time Nero ascended to the throne in 54 AD, the easy conquests were over. The treasury was not empty, but the burn rate was unsustainable. Then came the Great Fire of Rome in 64 AD. The reconstruction costs were astronomical. Nero needed to rebuild the city, build his golden house, and keep the legions loyal with bonuses. The arithmetic did not work. He had two choices: cut spending, which meant risking a coup, or find more money. He chose the shortcut. For the first time in Roman history, the emperor ordered the mint to reduce the silver content of the denarius. He dropped the purity from 100% to roughly 90%. He also slightly reduced the weight of the coin. To the average shopkeeper in the forum, the coin looked the same. It felt arguably the same, but the government had just created free money. They could mint more coins with the same amount of silver. The incentive was irresistible. It worked for a time. The inflation was not immediate, but the seal had been broken. Once the state realizes it can debase the currency to pay its bills, it never stops. Fast forward to the reign of Septimius Severus in the late 2nd century. The empire was under constant pressure on the frontiers. The loyalty of the army was the only thing keeping the emperor alive. On his deathbed, Severus famously told his sons, "Be harmonious, enrich the soldiers, and scorn all other men." To enrich the soldiers, his son Caracalla increased their pay by 50%. But the mines in Spain, the famous Rio Tinto mines which had supplied Rome with silver for centuries, were beginning to tap out. The easy surface silver was gone, the shafts were going deeper, requiring more slaves, more water pumps, and more engineering to extract less ore. The energy return on energy invested was plummeting. Faced with rising military costs and falling mining yields, Caracalla doubled down on the fraud. He introduced the Antoninianus, a double denarius. It was legally worth 2 denarii, but it contained only about 15 times the silver. It was a massive pay cut disguised as a raise. The markets eventually figured it out. Prices began to rise. The soldiers demanded more coins to buy the same amount of bread and wine. This created a feedback loop. The more the emperors debased the coin to pay the troops, the higher prices rose, requiring even more debasement. By the mid-3rd century, the situation had devolved into farce. The silver content of the currency had collapsed to less than 5%. The coins were essentially copper slugs washed in a thin layer of silver that rubbed off after a few weeks of use. The government, knowing the coins were worthless, refused to accept them for tax payments. They demanded taxes in kind, grain, cattle, and labor. Think about what that means. The state refused to accept its own money. The social contract shattered. A centurion in 235 AD, who had spent 20 years bleeding for the empire, found that his retirement bonus was worthless. He could not buy the farm he was promised. He could not buy land. The middle class, the shopkeepers, the clerks, the minor landowners, was wiped out. They held the currency while the elites held the land and the gold. The crisis was not just monetary, it was logistical, because the currency was untrustworthy. Long-distance trade broke down. A merchant in Gaul would not send pottery to Italy in exchange for copper coins that might be devalued again next week. The complex supply chains that fed the cities began to snap. Rome could no longer project power because it could not pay for the logistics of power. The legions, unpaid or paid in trash, revolted. Between 235 and 284 AD, Rome saw more than 20 emperors rise and fall, most of them assassinated by their own troops. The empire fractured into 3 pieces. It was eventually stitched back together by Aurelian and Diocletian, but the damage was permanent. The free market was dead, replaced by a command economy of price controls and forced labor. The silver was gone, and with it the liberty of the Roman citizen. Just like the Roman Empire, the Spanish Empire in the 16th and 17th centuries faced a crisis of resources and money, but with a twisted irony, they had too much of it. Following the discovery of the New World, Spain stumbled upon the greatest geological jackpot in history. In 1545, a native herdsman in the Viceroyalty of Peru discovered the Cerro Rico, the rich mountain of Potosi. It was a mountain of nearly pure silver ore. The extraction began immediately and on an industrial scale. The Spanish crown implemented the mida system, a form of forced labor where indigenous populations were drafted to work the mines in hellish conditions. The silver flowed out of the Andes, was minted into pieces of 8, carried by mules to the coast, and loaded onto the treasure fleets bound for Seville. The influx was staggering. Spain controlled the global money supply. The piece of 8 became the first true world reserve currency, accepted in the tea houses of China, the bazaars of India, and the markets of Europe. King Philip II was the master of the world. He had the best infantry, the largest navy, and an endless supply of money, but the arithmetic is merciless. The Spanish crown made a fatal strategic error. They confused money with wealth. They used the silver to buy finished goods from England, France, and the Netherlands. They used it to fight endless wars of religion across Europe. They did not use it to build a domestic industrial base. In fact, the flood of silver destroyed Spanish industry because silver was so abundant in Spain. Prices for domestic goods soared, a phenomenon we now call the Dutch disease. It became cheaper to import everything than to make it at home. The Spanish wool industry, once the envy of Europe, collapsed because it could uncompete with foreign textiles bought with Potosi silver. The Spanish economy became hollow. It was a logistical shell game. They were shipping silver out as fast as it came in to pay for armies in Flanders and navies in the Mediterranean. The crown was spending the silver before the fleets even arrived. They borrowed against future shipments, paying exorbitant interest rates to Genoese and German bankers. Then the geology fought back. The surface ores at Potosi began to degrade. The extraction costs rose. The Atlantic became dangerous as Dutch and English privateers hunted the treasure fleets. The flow of silver became erratic, but the crown's spending was fixed. Philip II, the most powerful man on earth, declared state bankruptcy not once but 4 times during his reign. Imagine the scene in Seville in the early 1600s. A dockworker watches the great galleons unload. He sees chests of silver being carried off, yet he cannot afford bread. The influx of money has driven prices up by 400% over the century, the so-called price revolution. He is starving in the shadow of a mountain of bullion. The wealth bypassed the people and went straight to the creditors and the wars. By the mid-17th century, Spain was a second-rate power. Its armies were unpaid, its ships were rotting, and its domestic economy was non-existent. They had extracted the wealth of a continent and had nothing to show for it but inflation and debt. The empire didn't fall because it lacked resources. It fell because it mismanaged the flow of those resources, believing that silver was a substitute for productivity. It wasn't. It was a drug, and Spain overdosed. Just like the Spanish Empire, the British Empire in the 20th century experienced a collision between imperial obligations and physical reality, leading to a rapid liquidation of its dominance. In 1914, Great Britain was the workshop of the world. The pound sterling was as good as gold. The Royal Navy controlled the shipping lanes, and London was the financial center of the globe. But the 2 world wars broke the back of British finance. The cost of fighting World War I was unprecedented. Britain had to borrow heavily from the United States and liquidate its foreign investments. It was a quiet default. The interwar years were a slow bleed. Britain struggled to return to the gold standard and failed. Then came World War II. To pay for survival, Britain shipped its gold reserves to North America and signed the Lend-Lease agreements, essentially mortgaging the empire to the United States. The British government, needing to repay silver bullion lent by the U.S. during the war, removed all silver from the coinage. The coins became geopolitical. Copper and nickel, the link to precious metals, was severed completely. The pound was now just a concept backed only by the promise of a debt-ridden state. But the monetary debasement was just a symptom of the industrial rot. They relied on imperial preference, forcing colonies to buy British goods rather than innovation. Britain, along with France and Israel, invaded Egypt to retake the Suez Canal. A shipyard worker in Glasgow in the 1960s watched as the orders dried up. The steelworks closed. The empire retreated, leaving behind a rust belt and a currency that devalued repeatedly. In 1949 and 1967, the British middle class saw their savings eroded by chronic inflation. The managed decline of Britain was a painful, decades-long process of adjusting living standards down to match the new reality of a post-imperial, resource-constrained nation. The pattern repeats in 7 distinct stages. Stage 1 is sound money and resource abundance. The nation has access to cheap, high-quality resources and uses a currency that is trusted and physically backed. Industry is competitive and the military is funded by genuine production surpluses. Stage 2 is overextension. The nation, confident in its dominance, takes on obligations it cannot sustain. It expands the military, builds bureaucracy, and initiates expensive social programs. The costs begin to outpace the natural growth of the economy. Stage 3 is the fiscal gap. Stage 4 is debasement. The government chooses the monetary shortcut. Prices rise. But more importantly, the lack of investment in the physical economy, mining, manufacturing, energy leads to shortages. The supply chains for critical goods become unreliable. Stage 7 is collapse and reset. The system can no longer be propped up. A crisis, a war, a pandemic, a financial crash exposes the hollowness of the structure. The currency fails or is redenominated. The political order is restructured, often violently. The nation is forced to live within its actual physical means, usually at a much lower standard of living. Just like Rome, Spain, and Britain, the United States is currently accelerating through these stages. Current data suggest we are firmly in Stage 5, transitioning into Stage 6. The warning signs are flashing in the supply chain of the U.S. military. The United States has spent decades offshoring its industrial base and financializing its economy. Here is the constraint: the United States does not mine enough silver. The U.S. produces roughly 1,000 metric tons of silver annually, but industrial demand alone is multiple times that amount. We are dependent on imports largely from Mexico and Peru, and refining capacity that is increasingly dominated by geopolitical rivals. China dominates the processing of rare earth minerals and strategic metals. The Department of Defense has let its strategic stockpiles dwindle. For years, the just-in-time efficiency model was applied to national defense inventory, was seen as waste. Now faced with the need to supply conflicts in Eastern Europe and the Middle East, the cupboard is bare. Raytheon and Lockheed Martin are reporting delays, not because they forgot how to build missiles, but because they cannot get the subcomponents. They are waiting on suppliers who are waiting on raw materials. The silver market itself is in a deficit for the last 3 years. Global demand for silver has outstripped global supply. The rise of solar energy, 5G technology, and electric vehicles has created a massive new industrial sink for silver. The military is now competing with the green energy transition for the same shrinking pile of metal. The arithmetic is merciless. You cannot have millions of solar panels, millions of EVs, and thousands of new missiles without a massive increase in mining supply, but mining output is flat or falling, or grades are declining. It takes 10 years to open a new mine. We do not have 10 years. This is the classic imperial trap. The commitments, defense treaties, social security interest on the debt are fixed, and rising. The physical capacity to meet those commitments is degrading. The government is masking this with trillion-dollar deficits, effectively printing money to chase scarce resources. This is exactly what Caracalla did. It is exactly what Philip II did. Some observers argue that technology will solve this. They claim that recycling or synthetic substitutes will bridge the gap. This is a dangerous fantasy. Recycling rates for industrial silver are low because the metal is consumed in tiny quantities across billions of devices. It is hard to recover. As for substitutes in high-stakes military applications, there is no substitute for physics. If you use a less conductive metal, your radar range drops, your processing speed slows, and your missile misses. In a war, second place is a death sentence. The endgame approaches in a predictable sequence. The first phase is controlled decline. We are seeing this now. It manifests as prioritization. The military will get the silver it needs, but the civilian sector will suffer. Prices for electronics, solar panels, and medical devices will soar. The government may invoke the Defense Production Act to seize inventories. Capital controls may be introduced to prevent wealth from fleeing the dollar into hard assets like silver and gold. The second phase is chaotic collapse. If a major conflict erupts, the supply chain breaks completely. The illusion of abundance vanishes overnight. The military cannot replenish its stocks. The currency loses its purchasing power internationally as exporters refuse to trade real resources for devaluing paper. This is the Suez moment for the US dollar, when the world realizes the emperor has no clothes, or rather no silver. The third phase is reset and restructure. History shows that when a fiat currency collapses due to a lack of physical backing, the new system is always tethered back to reality. A new monetary order emerges, likely backed by a basket of commodities: energy, gold, silver, agriculture. The nations that hold the physical resources dictate the terms. The nations that hold only debt are liquidated. The only variable is timing and pain. The geology has already cast its vote. The mines are what they are, the depletion rates are what they are. The laws of physics will not yield to an executive order or a Federal Reserve meeting. For the individual, the time for complacency is over. This is not a call to panic, but a call to attention. Educate yourself on the supply chains that support your life. Understand the difference between financial wealth and real wealth. Resilience is not about hoarding, it is about reducing dependence on fragile systems. Watch the inventories, watch the premiums on physical metal. Watch the delivery times for industrial goods. The data is there for those willing to look. The era of abundance is ending. The era of constraints has begun. Subscribe to stay ahead of the pattern. Prepare accordingly.